brain for those people who have impaired senses. This is a technique that is in some domains already quite common ground. And one example is cochlear implants, right? So this is...
See, day after day. This is what you see when your children come home from school and say, "Hi, Dad. Hi, Mom. How are you? Look what I got in school today," and they show you a report card. This is what you see when you're sitting in a taxi and it's going through a nice landscape and you're looking out the window. And this is what you see when you're looking at your office desk in the morning to see what you have to do for your work. As well, this is what you see when you're looking for that last piece of brownie cake on the refreshment table of the Amsterdam Neuroscience Conference. It isn't nice. And the thing is, this does not change. There's no getting better with time. There's no time heals everything factor involved in this one. It definitely wasn't for me. When I was 17 years old, I lost my first eye on the left side in an industrial accident. I went from binocular to monocular vision, which I could handle, but I only had one eye left. And luck has it, I ended up losing my right eye when I was 20 years old, 3 years later, in a similar accident. And at that time, there was just a little hope on my left side again to recover, because the retina was badly destroyed, but as time progressed, I got up to 2/120 vision back on that side. For 9 months, I had a small amount of vision, and it was dear to me. Although I couldn't recognize faces, and every time the light got bright, I would have no vision for a number of minutes from the overreaction of the light on the detached retina, I loved that bit of sight. But then when I went to get an operation on it, because the doctors warned me if I didn't, then I might lose that just from the retina not being nourished. That operation went wrong and I lost everything. September 14th, 1984, I started seeing absolutely that black that you see now. And you can uncover your eyes, by the way. This is my reality day after day. And there are a few things that get you when you lose your sight. The first one is the functionality, the obvious. You can't cross the street without thinking you're going to get squashed. You can't look at a person. You can't walk in a straight line and find your way to the bathroom if you're in a crowded place. So you really have to make adjustments, and a lot of times you're afraid to go out, but you have to force yourself to do that. There is a very high rehabilitational potential, though, because we are, in a way, wired to be able to function in the middle of the night if we have to. We lose most of that because of our electric lighting, and we never practice it when we're in everyday life. But as a blind person, you find this quickly, and you start to do things. I started to look after my children. I could change the diaper of my two-month-old child within a day after losing my sight. And I started to learn to cook, I learned to swim, I learned to do other things I never did before, and I even started to work on a different kind of job that I had. And before I knew it, I was more or less self-sufficient. I was bringing home the bread and butter again for the family. But the one thing that remained was I was in the dark world. And the dark world doesn't change, and new problems present themselves with every new change in life. Like I say, another child gets born, you don't see that child. A child comes home from school with their uniform on, you don't see that. You don't see the fact that maybe your parents are coming to visit, and you open the door and say, "Hi, Mom," but there's no mom standing there. It's just darkness. So this does not change. It does not change for me now. Grandchildren are being born, and I don't see those grandchildren. They are posting on Facebook. I don't see any of that. So obviously, I was looking for solutions. The first solution I was looking for was just to be back in the sighted world so that there was some sort of spatial sense, some sort of reality between myself and the environment that was beyond me. I had that chance in 2000. This was now 17 years after losing my sight. A man by the name of Dr. Dobell, he was kind of a basement engineer on artificial vision. He worked on a few volunteers in Canada at the time when it was still allowed in the early 70s. He had them implanted by a neurosurgeon, a young one by that time named Dr. John Gervin. These was small implants of 68 electrodes one side, and he was just trying to prove the biocompatibility aspect and the proof of concept, because there was no microcomputer yet that was available to power the system that he had in mind. In 2000, the microcomputers came out, the Pentium came out, and he figured this 166 processor was going to be ideal for this. So he was advertising for people to come out and kind of sacrifice themselves and pay $100,000 at the same time to try this out. A bilateral implant with 70 electrodes on each side. I was the first one in line. Part of that was because I had the money, and the other part was that I was living close, and I also wasn't considering so much the consequences. Sight at all cost, it was for me. I had a 5-year-old child, my youngest one of a few, and I wanted to see that child grow. I stood in line for the implantation, which was supposed to take 1 day, but it took 5 days to recover. I did have a big headache. I had these 2 jacks sticking out of the top of my head right here. And when we hooked up the computer for the first time, I could see each individual phosphene actually quite nicely. These were surface electrodes, 1 millimeter in diameter on the left side, 3 millimeter diameter on the right side, 70 on each side. I questioned the 3 millimeter ones, but Dr. Dobell told me that was probably the best choice he made, although he hadn't tested them in the volunteers. So I kind of scratched my head about that approach. As it was, those 3 millimeter ones were pretty bad because if they were slightly overstimulated, they drew an unbelievable amount of current, well over 30 MA, and then I would go into convulsions and kind of lose my memory temporarily for a few hours. So that was not good, and we had to be very careful. Nonetheless, once we had everything connected and we had everything mapped out, which was a very tedious process of me pointing out where I saw the phosphene in regards to my visual field in the center of vision, and they would match it to a pixel block accordingly on the camera. We turned on the system, and it was one of the biggest disappointments I had at that time. Instead of seeing a nice little neat image of a few dots going this way and a few dots going that way to show me what was out there, all I saw was a white flash 7 times a second, which was the frame rate of the system. So I was terribly discouraged, but Dr. Dobell assured me there was no taking it back out and there was no getting my money back, so I was kind of stuck where I was. Like I say, it was not an FDA-approved system at the time, so I had to bear with Dr. Dobell. We went to Portugal for the surgery because that was still legal to do at the time. We worked on it for a little bit longer, and within 3 days I was able to see my arm move across the front of my face when I was going like this. And it was actually quite rewarding. I was absolutely ecstatic, actually, of being able to see something. And as I was using the system to walk around the Dobell office, which was fairly large, about 11,000 square meters, I was avoiding chairs, and I was looking at door frames, and I would actually look up the door frame and across and down like that, and that would tell me where kind of my spatial sense was, even though I couldn't make it out just by using the phosphenes on their own. 2 days later, I had left this white cane standing against a wall somewhere, and I was away from it a ways, and I was looking around wondering where I put this darn thing when I saw it perfectly clear with this system. And at that point, I realized it was going to work. And it started to really blossom from there on. So somehow my brain was getting used to this and saying that this is what the input it needed. And I was starting to actually not even see those flashes because 7 frames a second was a little slower than what I wanted. But the flashes were smoothing over. And another thing that was smoothing over was the fact that if there was only 2 phosphenes to try to make a line, the space in between the phosphenes appeared to actually light up as well. Phosphene fusion, Dr. Dobell called it. So things were starting to fill in, and I was starting to make better and better pictures. I took the system home, and from there on, I started to really be able to do good things with it. I was able to, with only the 96 phosphenes that were active, 19 per frame, I was able to come into a restaurant I've been coming on for years, but never having any idea where I was, depending on sighted guide. Now I could stand in the doorway and say, I want that table there because there's no one sitting there, or I want that table there because it's by the window. This is the first time my children actually saw me caring whether I sat by a window or not because I wanted to look out of it. And when I looked out of a window, I would be able to see a passing car. I would be able to see people walking. They didn't look like people, mind you, but I knew there were people by the movement. And things like phone poles and trees, and that was pretty clear in the houses across the street. I could see the slants of the roof and where the windows were. At night, the system worked even better because of the quality of the camera. It worked better under electric light. And for the first time, I had a picture of the place where I've lived for the last 15 years in Canada. Albeit, the great euphoria was only a temporary situation. Within a few months, myself, along with 15 other implanted patients with whom I worked, because I had been hired at Dr. Dobell's Institute as patient rep, So I knew what was going on with them. We all lost a certain number of phosphines bit by bit. We kept coming into the office to get readjusted. Our system wasn't adjustable externally. So eventually, the voltages were up around the 16-volt region, and our electrodes started to really pain us. So we had to cut back on them. And when we got down to only 3 or 4 phosphines, we had to stop using our system. Around that time, Dr. Dobell tried upping the system from 140 electrodes in total to 484 electrodes with 3 newly implanted volunteers. We found a brand new set of challenges there, and one of them was the time it took to map on and threshold all these phosphines. It took weeks and weeks, and the patients were truly fatigued by the whole process. But the reason we couldn't use any automated systems was because anything that was implanted, it was so bulky that it moved when it was being closed up, the dura was being closed up. So it was a very laborious process trying to get these patients to get properly mapped and thresholded. Then in 2004, near the end of the year, 2.5 years after my implantation, Dr. Dobell dies. He died very unexpectedly. He just went to the hospital because he had problems with a diabetic ulcer on his remaining leg. And he had to have that amputated, and when that happened, then he just died. And along with that, the project died. He was funding most of the project out of pocket. Our $100,000 initially from the patient only covered a little percentage of the development fee, especially now that things were starting to go wrong and we probably had to change the implanted material. At that point, though, I knew that this was working. I knew that this was a viable and exciting prospect, and that it was actually having a positive impact on all of us patients who had it, except for one. One patient was 3 years old when he lost his sight. He was 14 when he was implanted. And as a result of his visual cortex not having developed appropriately just at 3 years old, he never was able to see the light sensations. The rest of us, including even a war vet who lost his sight at age 19 in World War II, he was 79 years old when he was implanted. He could see 37 of the phosphines. And with those 37 phosphines, he said he was walking without his cane for the first time in Louisiana in his home in the park, and he was able to see things he never knew existed before, like trees and benches and ornaments and things in the park. And he says it was really neat to be able to actually walk without the cane. So he'd fold it up, put it in his back pocket, and just walk. And this was an 80-year-old man losing his sight 60 years ago. Now, I am standing here talking to you about how I was able to see again, and this time, it wasn't taken away from me from bad luck. It wasn't taken away from me because nature took it and now there's no cure. I know there's a cure. Sight is out there. I have a working brain, a working visual cortex, as do many, many, many people in my situation. And they are waiting for this darkness to end. It is a major difference to be able to see a little bit versus nothing. A huge difference. Yes, I cannot still recognize people's faces with 96 phosphines. And these phosphines were all different shapes and sizes because of the nature of the surface electrodes. They kind of assault millions of neurons at the same time because of their shape and size. But imagine now if we had 500 of them in tiny pins going into the brain in very, very pre-located and organized fashion so that we'd be able to make decent images out of it. That potential is unbelievable. But even as it was with Dobell's system, I was able to go out and I was able to get a much higher quality of life. Even though I was still working the same jobs, I was still dependent on somebody else driving me. It wasn't only the independence that has to do with sight loss or sight retention. That minimum sight, that whether I had it through my retina that was still partially attached or whether it was through the Dobell system, mind you, the Dobell system was more reliable because it wouldn't just go dark suddenly, I was able to make spatial sense of my environment, and I was able to even reestablish my circadian rhythm. And this is all, most often taken for granted when we even see a little bit. We get up in the morning and there's light, so we feel awake and we're able to make it through the day, and then when the nighttime comes, it gets dark, we can sleep properly. For me, whether I am standing here right now talking to you or whether I'm in the middle of the night with my eyes closed, the difference is the same. So obviously it's going to be a little bit more difficult to go to sleep and to get up in the morning and stay awake. So that's why I have a lot of coffee during the daytime. But right now we have the NIN working on a system that is so exciting, and I mean, I don't know how much you know about it, but I will let the experts talk to you about that. But I am standing in line to get this implantation once again. This time I won't take it quite on that precarious nature I did with Dr. Dobell, but at the time I had no other choice. This time I can see that everything is being tested from beginning to end, and that the financial model doesn't just depend on handouts or something like the patient coming up with the money and the rest of it we kind of have to shortcut. So that was part of the problem with the Dobell project, is it just didn't have enough money and support. But I really expect this to happen in the future. I don't think that blindness now for me is an inevitable thing. It is curable. And from here on, it is through the support of the people around me, including you all, being in this field, that can change this and make my life better in the future. Thank you.
I think we should go around this table with chairs. Okay. So here's the staircase. Careful. Yeah. So and if you